We're going to talk about AI in our series of AI talks, but specifically a bit around what we've been talking about on our retreat, where we have this week and the prior week we had Shamala giving us a Tibetan Buddhist retreat, which brought up a lot of interesting topics, and I thought I would give a little bit of physics spin on those. And so this is part of a series of talks about AI and the evolution of AI in particular. And this one will be a little bit different, but still on the same theme, in that these are the talks so far along this series on the evolution of AI, but how it affects different kinds of things of human experience. And so this is about life and a bit on details of waves. And so today we're going to talk about life and death and what is life, and then some of the patterns that are existence from a science point of view in life, and then some of the implications of that for self, for reproduction, for change, and such things. And so to start out with, what is life and what is death? And one way to look at that is that they're the same thing, in that it's not specifically related to the common language meaning of life and death, that it's kind of information going through cycles and cycles of waves. And there's this concept of the primordial soup, and primordial translates to before death. And the primordial life is generally considered to be molecular chemistry and single cell organisms which reproduce by simply dividing, and that there isn't a birth, a life, and a death, that they're effectively immortal, and that death was really introduced with the invention of sex, which is important to us because that's the way that we reproduce. But actually the majority of organisms, microbes, reproduce asexually. And so they don't have death. They reproduce asexually, and the organisms effectively will live indefinitely unless they run out of food or they get eaten. And primordial also refers to single cell organisms, which are the majority of the different kinds of life on Earth, even though they're invisible for the most part. And this brings up the topic of waves that Shamala spoke about many times, that what are the properties of waves and what are the patterns of waves, and what do waves have to do with life and our experience of life. And waves, we normally think of them as, a wave in the ocean, in the water. But waves are a pattern in nature that is reproduced in many different ways. For example, this is a wave in the atmosphere, and it's an intrinsic pattern that's fundamental to physics and biology and life. And waves can also be small. In quantum mechanics, a wave of a particle, and wave theory and quantum mechanical theory or string theory is that information is in the form of waves, and matter is actually in the form of waves. And waves are predicting a statistical probability of where something will be in space and in time. And waves aren't just they're three-dimensional, and they're not just going in a straight line. This is a quantum mechanical visualization of the probability of where a particle is, or where an electron is, and that many people have heard about the wave-particle duality, and at the fundamental level, the wave property of matter or a particle is something that describes more accurately how it behaves, and it's not really a thing, it's an energetic wave, and these energies change over time. So this is like a depiction of where the properties of a particle are in space, but they move around probabilistically. And so when you hear about a particle vibrating or the energy of a particle, it's actually the wave function essentially shifting where something is likely to be.
In a desert plain in Tanzania, in the shadow of the volcano Oldonyo Lengai, there's a dune made of volcanic ash. The beautiful thing is that it moves bodily. It's what's technically known as a barkhan, and the entire dune walks across the desert in a westerly direction at a speed of about 17 meters per year. It retains its crescent shape and moves in the direction of the horns, what happens is that the wind blows the sand up the shallow slope on the other side, and then as each sand grain hits the top of the ridge, it cascades down on the inside of the crescent, and so the whole horn-shaped dune moves. Steve Brown points out that you and I are ourselves more like a wave than a permanent thing. He invites us, the reader, to think of an experience from your childhood, something you remember clearly, something you can see, feel, maybe even smell, as if you were really there. After all, you really were there at the time, weren't you? How else would you remember it? But here is the bombshell. You weren't there. Not a single atom that is in your body today was there when that event took place. Matter flows from place to place and momentarily comes together to be you. Whatever you are, therefore, you are not the stuff of which you are made. If that doesn't make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, read it again until it does, because it is important.
So that's Richard Dawkins describing the wave-particle duality of a person and our memories. And he points out that the memories aren't necessarily stored in the atoms or the neurons or the matter, because these things are replaced by food, basically. As we grow and we eat food, the atoms and molecules that make up our body today get metabolized and sloughed off and are replaced by the atoms and molecules that we're consuming from our food. But somehow our memories persist, or we think they do. And studies have shown that the memories that we have are actually not very attached to the original experience. There are interpretation of the memory over time, which changes, but somehow in our mind, the memories are persistent. And this is an illusion, just like our self being a separate, stable thing is an illusion, where we're constantly changing from moment to moment and day to day. And the way that waves propagate through the ocean, for example, is we have this sense, if we look out over an ocean, we see the waves and they appear to be moving, and we think, oh, the water is moving. But the water is really just going up and down, and the energy of the wave is what's moving. And so if you look at how the wave moves, the water goes up and down across time and distance, and the energy of the wave is moving across the water and not the water moving. And so this is an example where we're observing the energy of something move that's separate from the particles. And that's our experience of life is a little bit more like this than it is like the waves in a river where the water is moving. And so there's different kinds of waves, but a mechanical wave are, for example, like sound, where my voice comes out, it hits some air molecules, which then hits some more, that eventually hit your eardrum. And so that's a mechanical wave that is spreading through space and time, where the particles themselves are moving a little bit, but the energy of the wave moves, and the air particle right in front of my mouth does not reach your ear, just the energy from the wave. And a series of particles in a mechanical cascade moves towards you. And then light waves, or electromagnetic waves like radio frequencies and light, have a unique property where it oscillates between electricity and magnetism in an opposite pole. And the light wave propagates through space and time in a way that it can persist longer. And one exotic theory of this is that this is like life and death, as it changes from electricity to magnetism, where the magnetism is dying and the energy is being converted to electricity and then back again. And so this is like cycles of life that are propagating in a wave. And so a pantheological view of this is that light is alive, and these electromagnetic waves are essentially births and deaths oscillating over time and space. And then waves can travel through space in these two ways, but they also they're standing waves where it's not moving, it's an oscillation. And so in string theory and in quantum mechanics, the properties of matter and the universe are made up of these various kinds of waves in different combinations. and that this is the way that you would describe not just energy and movement, but you would describe particles and matter and things like this using combinations of these kinds of waves. And then the waves are at different frequencies, and so you can build up combinations of different frequencies into complex modulations. And so some of the formations of biology, for example, here's a shell that is very clearly related to different oscillations at different frequencies simultaneously being expressed in a form of matter. And it may be that all matter is constructed this way down to an electron or an atom, that combinations of waves moving and standing and mechanical and so forth at different frequencies can construct essentially any form. And so this is the premise of string theory and quantum mechanics of how things are built up from. And so our sense of self, which we've heard is not a persistent thing, it's a changing thing, is also can be described in these sort of waveforms, in that our experience or our consciousness of life is our self as a wave moving through time and space, but not the same from moment to moment. And we're not, our consciousness or our experience is not the wave itself, it's our experience of kind of riding on the wave. So that, and then this concept of a duality, or that there's, our self is made up of masculine, feminine, or good and bad, or different kinds of dualistic concepts of the same thing, is often depicted as yin and yang. But there's a lot of meaning to that, there are different kinds of nested waves that are cycling. And they're cycling in multiple dimensions, not just in two dimensions as it's often depicted. And they're cycling in more complex patterns of waves, where it's not just a simple pattern, but it can be a complex pattern that changes over time and morphology. And then the concept has come up, we talk often about limbic resonance, but we've also discussed the concept of morphic resonance, which is related in that it's a resonance between something that has a fundamental wave property that stimulates a similar related wave property in an adjacent material that might have slightly different physical properties, so it might resonate at slightly different frequencies. But just as limbic resonance between me and you right now, you can feel what I'm feeling, and you can feel it in your body and in your fingers, and that's a resonance between me and you. And this can happen across not just space, like the resonance we feel in this room, but across time as well. So this concept of morphic resonance that's been brought up is that things that are somewhat similar will vibrate in resonance with the things that are adjacent vibrating. And the morphic resonance from Rupert Sheldrake is that, who's a theoretical chemist, so he comes at this from a biophysics chemistry kind of point of view. But for example, morphic resonance between individual people, are adjacent people have a predilection to resonate with certain things, but not other things. And so the types of things we would say with a song or with words or a prayer or a poem will resonate with some people and more with certain people, but they won't necessarily resonate with the tree or the building to the same extent. And so the morphic resonance is there's a predilection to resonate as something that is at the appropriate combination of stimulus, like the one guitar string, and the other guitar string will resonate with that. But it's the coupling between is thought to be by waves generally, and either mechanical or electromagnetic. And then the thing is what is something that's alive and what is consciousness? And this is a kind of biochemistry, but here's single cell organisms, a paramecium being eaten by an amoeba, and there's two parameciums there. And they're not so much aware until they get surrounded and start to be consumed by the predator. And are they conscious? Are they sentient? They don't have a brain. They don't have nerves. They're obviously responding to this circumstance, and that they're separate cells for a moment until they're digested. and then they're part of the predator. And and people generally consider single cell organisms as not being intelligent, not being conscious, not having a nervous system, not having a brain, not having behavior, but obviously they do. And so this brings to the distinction between single cell reproduction and sexual reproduction, asexual and sexual. And that, as I mentioned, most organisms by number are single cell organisms, and they reproduce without sex. They reproduce by dividing, in that they don't age, they don't have gender. The offspring are clones of each other, and that they're continue to evolve like this, where relatively recent, only 3 billion years ago, as opposed to 4.5 billion years ago, sexuality was invented by evolution, and the concept of gender was invented afterwards. And so there's asexual organisms that continue to exist, but they're vulnerable to both predators and parasites because they're all clones of each other. And so the way to stay ahead of the parasites and predators is to change your design on a frequent basis, so that the predator doesn't know what to hunt and the parasites don't know how to attack the next generation. And so the part of the invention of sex was to invent death, in that the single cell organisms generally don't have death in that same way, or they don't have aging and death the way that more sexual reproducing organisms do. And that if you don't kill off the prior generation after they reproduce, you leave a reservoir of the old design that the parasites and the predators can prey upon and fester in until they can figure out how to attack the new design. So those creatures that reproduce sexually specifically are doing it to stay ahead of the predators and the prey. And so they have to more or less starve out the predators and parasites by changing the design. And so this is essentially shuffling the cards. So if you're like playing a card game and you don't shuffle the cards, it allows the opportunity for the parasite or the predator to count the cards and essentially know what to anticipate, and it would attack the vulnerability. Whereas if you shuffle the cards on a frequent basis, you can stay ahead of the parasite or the predator. And so that's essentially what sex is doing genetically, is that it's creating a mix-up of the design to stay ahead. And so this creates a diversity of designs, and that the natural selection and evolution decides which designs will survive or not based on how they've mutated. They're mutating by just shuffling the cards to stay ahead, but some of the designs are more survivable than others. And so death is part of this, is part of the sexual reproduction process. For example, trees shuffle the designs of their leaves on a seasonal basis. The leaves of the tree are dying, but it doesn't mean the organism is dying, that it's just a seasonal change, that it would be too costly to maintain the leaves through the winter generally. And so it sloughs them off, and it also is a way to survive longer. So some versions of trees, for example, this is thought to be the largest and oldest organism on Earth. It's a grove of aspen type trees, that it's one organism, and its root system is thought to be about 14,000 years old. And the different trees sticking up are actually almost like flowers. They're clones of each other. So there's like 50,000 different trees that are all attached to the same root system, that are all part of the same organism that's been with the same genetics that's been living for 15,000 years. But the individual trees and their leaves come off seasonally, and the individual trees come and go, but they're all the same. And so this is like a way of where part of the organism is dying. It appears like the leaves fall off or the individual trees die, but the root system is persistent for a very long time. And fungus or mycelium networks work in a similar way, where the living part of a mushroom fungus is actually the network underground. And the different things that we call mushrooms that are popping up are more like flowers that come and go. They're not the living creatures so much. And so how does this look in humans? Well, here's a way of kind of mapping humans over time, where this is the population in China going forward. The red is females, the blue is males, and how the ratio of these change over time. So this is going forward from today, and the ratio of males to females and the size of the population is by how wide it is. And so this changes in a wave-like format that's similar. And so if you look at, say, Japan from over the last 100 years, the wide part at the bottom is younger age people, and as it goes up, they're aging and becoming older. And there's World War II, where the large number of males were killed, and the darker colored on the side is what they call excess, where when the large number of males were killed, there was more females than males. So it was considered an excess. And today there's a little excess of males and a shortage of females in a sense. And so this is a way of looking at waves through populations of, for example, people. And this happens in other sexual generating species populations, so World War II again, and then the excess females and the shortage of males. And then a baby boom comes, which increases the population, but now the population is decreasing. So this species or this strategy may go extinct. And so the change of these things, these different kinds of waves, a different abstraction, is some things change very fast, like fashion or governments even, and other things change slower. So in the case of, say, culture like Japan versus China, or nature of one kind of species or another kind of species, the pace of change, which is depicted by how big the arrow is happening at the same time. And these things are all interlinked, but it's like multiple different waves traveling at different speeds. And so this is a depiction of how religions' waves have spread across land over 10,000 years. So first Hinduism spreading, there's the birth of Buddha. Jesus and Judaism and Christianity spreading through Europe. And then Islam spreading in places where other religions weren't. So these are like different species that have individual lifespan, seasonal lifespan, and then aging and death. But they don't, so far, reproduce sexually. So they're expanding to fill all available niches. So with slightly different properties. So these are collections of individuals that have a common morphic resonance that is spreading across an environment, and they're filling all the available niches. And so how do these things spread across space and across time? And so this is an interesting problem, that religions are essentially ideas. They're like Richard Dawkins, who was in the first video there, was who invented the concept of memes, which is the equivalent of a gene, but a gene is a biochemical thing coded in DNA, where a meme is an idea that can transmit across space and time without the burden of biochemistry. And so how do you spread things biologically is essentially genes, and then how do you spread things in terms of information is essentially memes. And biological, and then the memes are spread to a large extent, like religions are spread by monasteries. And so here's a map of monasteries and how the morphic resonance spreads from one to another by memes being practiced in each location, which then stimulates other locations to practice similar ones, but distant locations are less resonant with the closer ones. So like a limbic resonance, but they spread across distance this way and can spread across time. And how do you spread across both time and distance is the memes can spread across distance on the internet through things like Zoom, which are live programming real time, that is in the same time but different location. That's across space. And then if you can do recording, the memes can spread across time in addition to distance. So how do you transmit across both space and time? It's essentially a combination of Zoom and YouTube, where essentially the ideas are moving across distance, but also into future times. And so this is a time-space transmission of ideas. And ideas are an evolutionary improvement over DNA genetics, or it's an encoding in things that can then travel at across time and space at the speed of light without much resistance. And so the internet is essentially a new kind of physical reality where the transmission of this kind of information and ideas can go faster and further, not just across distance, but across time into the future. And so it may be a new form of life that is carrying the information. And so here's a picture of the routers on the internet that they're changing. If you notice, there's the red moves across the earth, more or less where the sun is shining. And that's where people are awake and they're actively using their computers and phones. And so the routers are busy routing their material. And when the sun is down and the people are sleeping, the routers are quieter and the information flow is a little bit less. And so this is essentially the information activity of awake and asleep internet on the earth, and the awake and asleep goes with the sun just as the people in it. And so sometimes people refer to the brain being the most complicated thing in the universe, but it's not, because the internet is made up of 4 billion brains, which is a lot more complicated than one brain. And that this is the information spreading across time and place, which is essentially life, but life in electronic form. And so we've talked about, and so this is part of a trend of going from life and information being coded in atoms and chemistry and biochemistry and genetics into bits, where you can transfer ideas into bits, and then the bits have their own unique properties that has evolutionary advantages over traditional biochemistry. And so this is where AI comes into play, is that the information is static, but when the information can be alive, it can process based on the memory it has. And so first, computers had to develop the capability of memory, and then the ability to make decisions about that memory is essentially what AI is doing. It's a new form of life that can travel across time and space and reproduce. And it's not bound by a place. It doesn't need a physical monastery. It doesn't need a planet. And it can transfer across time. So in terms of immortality, information doesn't die. It can be reproduced and is persistent across time. And so our experience of life and our consciousness can be viewed as surfing on an information wave that's increasingly we're becoming information, and who we are as an adult, ourself as an adult, includes our social media profile and our memory and our phone and stuff like that, that is not DNA, it's not even in our body, but it's an extension of who we are. So there's some thoughts to stimulate questions or comments or discussion.